All right, we're back. So again, we have the quilt top. It's all sewn together, all the little blocks, and now we're going to work to add the borders around this rectangle. Once we sew the borders, then we're gonna go ahead and sandwich it together and do all of the quilting. So to get started, we have 1-inch strips that we cut originally, and then we have a 1.5-inch strip, and they're gonna piece together just like this right around all 4 sides. So first we're gonna need to cut the 1-inch strip into 2 16.5-inch strips, and then also 2 12-inch strips. Then we're gonna take the long strip, this is the 16.5-inch strip, with right sides together. We're gonna put it along the long edge of the quilt top with equal amounts of the ends extending past. And these will get trimmed off after, but to begin, it's longer just to make sure that you have enough to overlap your corners. So we're gonna line this up, right sides together. So you can pin at the center and then work your way to pinning the rest of the side. Then we're gonna take this over to the sewing machine. We're gonna stitch this side seam line here with a 1/4-inch seam allowance. Then you'll set this down and press this stitching line. Then we're gonna push the border open with the seam allowance pointing towards the border, and then we'll go ahead and press that flat. Now we're going to take our ruler and just trim off the parts right here that are extending past the edge of the quilt. So I'm just gonna line that up and trim those off. Then I'm gonna bring in the 12-inch piece, and then we're gonna put that with right sides together along the top, and it extends past both edges a little bit wider than it needs to be. Make sure that the borders on both of the long sides are pressed open, and then you'll just pin at the center first, work your way to the edges. Then we're gonna take this over to the machine and stitch right down along that seam line with a 1/4-inch seam allowance. Then you'll press to set the seam, push the border open, and then press that. And then we're gonna repeat that whole process for the opposite short end of the quilt top. Okay, so here we have all 4 pieces of that first narrow border sewn on. I'm gonna go ahead and trim off these little end pieces. And then I'm gonna bring in the 2 longer pieces of the 1.5-inch border. These are cut 17 inches long. So this now is gonna go right sides together along the whole length of the long side. And again, there'll be a little bit of an extension along each end just to make sure that there's enough fabric for the overlap. So we'll place that right sides together and then pin along that side, and then go ahead and stitch that with a 1/4-inch seam allowance. We'll take the other strip and place that on the opposite long side and do the exact same thing. So we'll have both long strips sewn. Okay, now we have the 2 second sets of the long side sewn, and then we're going to bring in the shorter of the 1.5-inch strips. These ones were 14.5 inches long, and then we're gonna do the same thing. After we trim off these little extensions right here, we're gonna even out this line, and then with right sides together, we're gonna place this centered in the middle. So again, we have a little bit extending on both sides. We'll line this up, right sides together, and then go ahead and with a 1/4-inch seam allowance, stitch this down along the top edge, and then we'll repeat that for that second bottom edge as well, and then go ahead and press all of it. All right, so here we have the top. It's looking really fantastic. We have all 4 sections of the 2 borders sewn on. So now we're gonna work to do the 3rd section that goes all the way around. And for the intermediate pattern, we're gonna do that with all of the extra pieces that we have from those strips that we sewed together. So this one's a little bit complicated. We'll go through this whole process. I'm also just gonna show you on the easy variation here, this is a different version of the small blocks in the middle. This one uses just 3 solid strips to create those border pieces before you put the binding on. So for this one, you can see it's just 1 solid piece of fabric on the yellow here that's created that 3rd section. So if you wanna do that on the intermediate quilt design, you're welcome to do that as well. It would be a little bit faster and speed that process up. You could also do the intermediate level piecing around the easy version of the quilt if you wanted to mix it up a little bit. So to create the strip for the border, we're going to take all of the pieces that we have. If you already have them cut into 4.5-inch blocks like I have here, I have a whole stack, you'll just go in and you're going to want to cut each of these into 2-inch strips. You could also just cut them in half, and then once you have them sewn together, even out your strip so that it's 2 inches wide. If you cut this in half right here, it's 4.5 inches, so you'll have a little bit of extra. It might be faster just to cut it out that way. If you had full strips left over, then you would simply just go through and cut 2-inch sections down the length of the strips that you have left. Now, one of the nice things about the acrylic rulers, a lot of them are 2 inches wide. So this makes this really fast to just line up your straight edge along the side of your ruler and then go through and just make your cuts. You're going to want to cut a total of 18 sections, and then to do the border on the quilt, you're going to need 5 sections sewn together for the long sides and 4 sections sewn together for the short side. So when you have your 5 pieces, what you're going to do is make sure that they're all going in the same repeating order, and then we're going to fold them with right sides together, and we'll just stitch that 1/4-inch seam line right here, and then we'll press it open, and you'll connect the next one and press it open, and you'll end up with a long line of these all in repeating order. And here we have both of those border pieces. So you can see I have the 2 longer ones. These are with the 5 sections together, and the 2 shorter ones with the 4 sections together. And again, making sure that I sew those together so that I have the same repeating order all the way down all 4 strips. So now we're going to take the 2 longer ones, and I'm going to sew those to both long edges of the quilt top. So I'm going to find the center, and I can do that just by folding in half. Then I'm going to open that up here. I'm going to place this center seam lining up with the center of the quilt, right sides together, and that's going to be the center point. So this again is going to extend out past the edge, but what I'm going to want to have happen is just to make sure that this little seam right here lines up with the end, allowing that 1/4-inch seam allowance to line up. So the edge of the fabric is lining up with the edge of the border, and we'll end up trimming that off. So you just want to pin that down really carefully so that you have that evenly spaced, and you will have the edge of that lining up correctly on both ends. Then I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine. We're going to sew this carefully with a 1/4-inch seam allowance down the length of the side. I'm going to position it a little bit differently, folding back the quilt top so that we can fit this in, sewing with the seam allowances all pressed down as they go under the foot. It'll make it a lot easier and more consistent when we stitch this seam line. Then once we have this sewn, we're going to press that stitching line to set the seam, and then fold the border back, and then go ahead and press that, and then repeat that for the opposite side. Here we have both of those long sides sewn on, and now I have the short ends to do. So I'm going to come in and trim these off. So there I have a flush edge, and then I'm going to take the shorter strip. This was the 4 sections sewn together, and with right sides together, we're going to position that along this shorter end. So you just want to pay attention to the direction that your stripes are going. You want to have them go all the way around the quilt in the same order. So it's pretty easy to get them flipped around. So you can just look at your prior corner here and just make sure that you're following the same direction. So if I look at this corner right here, you can see that I have white, blue, pink, and then the yellow color. So I want to go in that same order. So here I have white, blue, pink, yellow, and it continues around. So it'll just continue around the whole thing as it comes and wraps the other corner. So I'm going to be just like this. I'm going to center it with right sides together. We're going to put this down, lining up the center seam with the center seam, and then looking at the way both ends line up at the edge so that we have it centered right. And then we'll take this over to the machine, and we'll stitch down here with a 1/4-inch seam allowance down the length of the short side, press to set the seam, and then flip the border open, and then press that open, and then we'll repeat that for the opposite end of the quilt. Now we have all 4 edges of the border sewn on, so at this point the quilt top is fully complete. It looks really cute. I'm really excited to now just finish up the last few steps. So what we're going to do at this point is bring over our backing and the batting. They're both cut 18 by 24. So what we're gonna do is lay the backing with the right side down, and we're gonna create a sandwich. So the backing and then the batting. Again, these two pieces are cut the same size. So you can see here I have them lined up at the edge. Then I'm gonna bring back the quilt top, and this is right side up and it is smaller. So as I move this around, you can see that I have this extending out along all four sides. And this is all gonna get trimmed off after. It just makes the quilting process work a lot better at this point to have it cut a little bit larger than your quilt top. So we're gonna base this down with safety pins, and you wanna start at the center and then just kind of pull it, not pulling a lot, but just nice and tight so that it's really flat and smooth. And then we'll go ahead and just pin around a couple inches apart to have this all sandwiched together, and you'll go and you'll do that through all 3 layers. Then we're going to take this over to the machine, and again I would start towards the center of the quilt, and you're going to quilt through all 3 layers. You can do that in a variety of patterns. You could follow all the straight seam lines and stitch in the ditch, or you could follow your diagonal lines and go around your diamonds stitching in the ditch. But you just want to do the same pattern throughout, and then when you come around to the edges, you can stitch in the ditch along these border edges as well. Now that we have it quilted, it's sewn through all 3 layers. I just went around the diamond areas, and then I went around the borders right in those stitched in the ditch right along those seam lines. So now I have this final border not sewn down, but the backing and the batting are extending out past that outside edge. So I'm just going to take my ruler and my rotary cutter, and I'm going to even all of this off. And then we're going to go ahead and just use the binding and finish off the edge, which will close this and it will cover this raw edge. So to do that, you're going to use your 2-inch strips that you cut at the beginning. We're going to cut them. We need 2 that are 23 inches long, and then we need 2 that are 18 inches long. Now we're going to take the binding pieces. This is the 2 23-inch long pieces. Just fold them in half the long way. Press so that you have that pressed all the way down. Then we're going to bring that binding. We're going to line up the raw edge with the raw edge of the quilt. You're going to center that so that you have pieces going past both ends. We're going to center that, pin this right along, matching up raw edges, and then sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance right down the length of that seam. And then you'll go ahead, press to set the seam, and then press to fold that binding up. Then the binding is going to wrap around to the back side of the quilt, and you're going to want to pin that down the length of the seam. And then you can either stitch in the ditch from the top side, or you can use a hand sewn blind stitch to sew that down to the bottom side of the quilt. Then you're going to want to repeat that for the other long edge of the quilt top. Here we have those 2 long sides done with the binding, and we just went ahead and did stitch in the ditch right on there to sew those down. So now I'm just going to trim off these extra pieces on the end. And then we're going to take the shorter pieces, and we're just going to do the same thing to stitch down the binding, matching up the raw edges on both the top and the bottom end. And then we'll press and set that seam, and then we'll fold it over as well. And then we have one little quick tip to show you for how to fold in those corners. Now we have that top edge of the binding. It's sewn down. We did that right sides together. So we just need to have 1 inch coming out here from the extension. So I'm just going to trim this down a little bit. Okay, so then we're going to take this, and we have it folded up. The seam allowance is pressed up. You're going to want to carefully just fold this over so that it's wrapping around and covering that raw edge. And then you're going to fold the binding over and pin that down. And then you'll finish pinning down your binding the same as you did the first time. So it's all tucked in and you don't have any raw edge, and you have a nice clean corner. And then once you have that pinned down, you'll just go ahead and do the same thing. You can either stitch in a ditch from the top side, or you can carefully do a hand sewn blind stitch around the top and the bottom edges. And here we have the finished quilt. It looks fantastic. So we've learned a lot along the way. We have a lot of different techniques that we've learned and that we can practice in the future. And now we get to take our quilt and we can assemble the whole entire bed setup. So stay tuned. In the next video, we will go over some great ways to add to your bedding and create a whole perfect little bed setup.